You are thousands of feet above sea level, surrounded by nothing but the blinding whiteness of snow and ice. The cold bites at your skin, and the thin air makes every breath a struggle. No food, no hope, and no idea if you'll live to see another day. This was the reality for 45 passengers aboard a small chartered plane in 1972. But before the nightmare began, there was a moment of calm, a time when the future still seemed full of promise. These passengers were on their way to Chile for a rugby match. They joked, they laughed, and they looked forward to the adventure ahead. The date was October 12, 1972. The Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild FH-227D had been chartered to fly the Old Christians Club, a rugby team made up of former students from a prestigious college in Montevideo, Uruguay. Alongside the team were their friends, family members, and a few supporters, making a total of 45 souls aboard the flight. As they soared through the skies, the landscape below them transformed into the rugged, snow-covered peaks of the Andes. These mountains were majestic and seemingly endless. These very mountains were about to become their prison. The flight progressed smoothly, and the passengers relaxed into their seats. But as the plane approached the Andes, the weather began to change. Thick clouds rolled in, obscuring the pilot's view. It was making navigation increasingly difficult. The pilots worked to keep the aircraft on course. Unknown to them, they were already off track. Then, in an instant, everything changed. The pilots made a critical error. Believing they had cleared the mountains, they began to descend, only to find themselves surrounded by towering peaks. The passengers felt the sudden jolt as the plane struck a mountain, and at that moment, their world turned upside down. The aircraft skidded across the snow. Its fuselage tore apart as it slammed into the rocks. The deafening noise of metal grinding against stone filled the air, followed by the terrifying silence that came after the impact. In the blink of an eye, 12 people were killed, including both pilots. The survivors were thrown about like rag doll. The cold was immediate and intense, but the horror had only just begun. They were high up in the Andes, miles from civilization, with no way to call for help. The wreckage of the plane offered little shelter from the freezing temperatures, and their injuries made every movement an ordeal. The first night was one of pure agony as they tried to stay warm and tend to the wounded. As the days passed, the situation grew more desperate. They had no food, no medical supplies, and no clear plan for survival. With every breath, they inhaled the thin, icy air that barely sustained their lungs. Yet, amid the despair, a faint glimmer of hope remained. They believed that rescue was imminent, but as the hours turned into days, hope began to fade. The harsh reality set in. They were on their own. The search team, believing the survivors had perished in the crash or succumbed to the elements, had already called off the search. Food was scarce, and what little they had was quickly running out. A few chocolate bars, a couple of bottles of wine, and some snacks were all they had to sustain them. They rationed the food as best as they could, but it wasn't enough. Hunger gnawed at them, growing more intense with each passing day. By this point, many of them were suffering from frostbite and hypothermia. To make matters worse, some of the survivors were gravely injured. They needed medical attention that was far beyond the capabilities of their makeshift first aid effort. Every day was a fight to keep the weakest among them alive. The survivors did what they could to care for each other, but with no medical supplies and no means of communication, their situation seemed hopeless. But they refused to give up. They scavenged the wreckage for anything that could be of use. They found a small transistor radio and listened for news, clinging to the hope that they might hear of a rescue mission. But the news that came was devastating. The search had been called off. The world had given up on them. Yet, even in the face of such despair, the survivors were determined to stay alive. They built makeshift shelters out of the plane's debris, using seat cushions and metal scraps to shield themselves from the biting wind. They melted snow for water, carefully rationing each drop. But despite their best efforts, their situation grew more dire with each passing day. The combination of starvation, injury, and the brutal environment was taking its toll. They were running out of options, and the will to survive was being tested in ways they had never imagined. As the days turned into weeks, the food was gone. They had eaten every crumb, drunk every drop, and scoured the wreckage for anything remotely edible. The mountains offered no refuge. There were no animals to hunt and no vegetation to forage. The survivors were starving. Their strength was waning, and they knew that without food, they would not last much longer. It was in this state of desperation that the unthinkable became a possibility. The unalive bodies had been preserved by the freezing temperatures. The thought was repulsive against every moral and religious belief they held. But as their situation grew more desperate, the survivors were forced to confront a terrible truth. To survive, they would have to do the unimaginable. In the end, the will to survive was stronger than the taboo. Some could not bring themselves to eat, their stomachs turning at the sight. Others forced themselves to swallow, knowing that it was their only chance of survival. Each bite was a battle, but as the days passed, the act became a grim routine. The survivors learned to dissociate, to focus on the need to survive. They had no choice. Their bodies needed the calories and the protein to keep going. And so, they did what they had to do. They ate, they survived, and they prayed that one day they would be forgiven. Eventually, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, two of the strongest and most determined survivors, volunteered to make the trek. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew that staying meant certain death. With the blessings of the remaining survivors and what little supplies they could carry, they set off to find help and bring it back to their friends. They climbed through snow-covered peaks, traversed icy slopes, and navigated valleys that seemed to stretch on forever. For days, they walked, guided by instinct and a sheer will to survive. They had no maps, no clear direction, only a desperate belief that they would eventually find someone, anyone, who could help. And then, after 10 days, they spotted a Chilean shepherd. With what little energy they had left, they waved, shouted, and did everything they could to get his attention. When the shepherd saw them, he must have thought he was seeing ghosts. Two emaciated, sunburned figures emerged from the mountains, barely alive. The shepherd immediately set off to alert the authority. Word quickly spread, and within hours, a rescue mission was launched. The first rescue team reached the remaining survivors on December 20th, 1972, more than 2 months after the crash. The sight that greeted them was beyond belief. A group of skeletal figures huddled together in the wreckage, their eyes hollow, their bodies ravaged by starvation and cold. But they were alive. Against all odds, they had survived. The rescue was nothing short of miraculous. The survivors were airlifted out of the mountains one by one, taken to safety after 72 days of unimaginable suffering.